Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Sonja Blignaut. Damn it. I'm trying to pronounce your surname before we came on. It's okay, but it's, yeah.
We're almost there.
Almost. Welcome, Sonya. The reason I'm reaching out is that you wrote a chapter, and in fact, I think you were one of the main sort of instigators behind the book Cynefin at 21. And for those who are not familiar, Cynefin is a particular framework in the field of complexity, which I'm sure we'll get into. But Sonya, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. And you're coming to us all the way from just outside Johannesburg, right? In South Africa. Yeah.
Yes, I'm
go on.
In Pretoria, just next to Johannesburg. So
yeah.
Yes.
So I'm thinking for our audience, this theme comes up again and again on the show Being Human, and we have a particular meaning of complexity, right? This is sort of big C complexity, isn't it? It's a whole field, it's a science, and I think for people who are kind of new to this, could you just start with a little bit of an explanation about what we mean by complexity in the way that you think about it and work with it?
It's so interesting, Richard. I decided to crowdsource a couple of definitions yesterday on Twitter, because it's so difficult to explain complexity without falling into very academic language and big words. But for me, complexity is essentially entangled messiness. It arises from the interconnections between things, and it's when different kind of aspects of a system are connected in what I think it's Mary Ulbeen. She talks about rich interconnectedness. So it's when that interconnections actually starts changing the agents that are connecting. So that's the key difference between a complicated system where the parts are connecting, but it's in predictable ways. And if you think of a machine, when one part connects to another, the parts don't change. But in a complex system, just the fact that you and I are connecting now, we are changing through that connection, and everybody else who's connected to us and who's listening to this, there'll be shifts that we can't predict. So for me, it's that kind of entangled interconnectedness that defines complexity.
Right. And sort of what's your history with it? When did you first get involved and sort of familiar with these particular ways of thinking?
So I was first introduced formally to complexity by Dave Snowden. This was in the early 2000s. We were both working for IBM at the time, and he was at that stage. He was still telling stories about going to the Pentagon, and 9/11 had just happened. But I think I always had kind of a natural affinity towards complexity. So I studied as a meteorologist, so I come from the natural sciences. And through a very long and potentially boring story, I ended up as a consultant in IBM. And being a consultant in the big five, kind of way that they approach things, I just never resonated with that. Selling recipes, treating each context as if it's the same, that kind of just never resonated with me. So I think what Dave did was he gave me language for something that I already had a bit of an affinity for. But that's kind of where my journey started. And I think for me personally, it fundamentally changed how I see and interact with the world. I guess I can almost say it's become the organizing principle around which, most of my life revolves. So I'm not sure it happens to everybody, but that was kind of what happened to me.
Wow. So what was that's a big statement. So what were some of the things that started to shift in your perspective and I don't know where you interacted with the world once you became familiar with this?
I think it was, in Cynefin, but I think it's broader than Cynefin. In complexity, there's this idea called messy coherence. From a Cynefin perspective, it plays out, in we believe in bounded applicability. So things like methods and tools, they've got boundaries in terms of where they apply and where they lose their usefulness. And I think what just really struck me, even thinking about my personal life experiences through this lens of understanding that not all the systems that I'm interacting with are similar. Not all problems that I deal with are the same. And, trying to, I think a lot of things that frustrated me, like tools that used to work and suddenly they didn't work anymore, or even relational issues that I came across. South Africa also, as you would know, we don't have a shortage of complex problems. And just understanding all of a sudden, being able to see that one of the reasons why we're not able to solve these problems is that because some of them are unsolvable. They're patterns that we can shift, but we're wasting our time and energy with many of the things that we're doing. I think all of that just kind of combined to help me understand also why I didn't enjoy being a consultant in the IBM context. So yeah, those are some of the, as you can hear, it kind of permeated everything. So
yeah. So what were some of the things you didn't enjoy about being a consultant that applies here?
It just felt exploitative, like in all directions. And I think a key thing, and understanding how a typical consulting business model works, it's all about utilization. You don't want people on the bench. And one of the best ways to do that is to create best practice based, like recipes that you can sell to multiple clients at the same time. And I think what I saw happening was, we were charging exorbitant rates, but not really adding value to client. We were taking something that we just implemented in a bank, for example, with some success, and then we just wanted to take it into an electrical utility, for argument's sake, without adapting to that context. And I think that just, it never sat well with me. And I felt that fundamentally I wasn't adding value. And I was pushing products onto clients, knowing that, it probably won't work for them. And so there was, what I loved about complexity and in particular, some of the Cynefin work that Dave pioneered at that stage was there was an inherent integrity to it. We entered the system fully aware that we are seeing it as a unique system, and we can't just bring our preconceived ideas. And so I think, one of my clients, I do some work with IKEA, and a while back, she said, my main client, they said something that I just really appreciated. And she said, when we work with you, you sell us, or you inspire us, you sell us leadership, not followership. You're not trying to sell us something that other people have done. You're helping us make sense of what we want to do in a context-specific, context-relevant way. And I really appreciated that comment.
Wow. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. You're selling leadership, not followership. Yeah. But I think what's interesting is often clients feel somehow more comfortable following, right? Well, if this bank did it, then, maybe if we try it, at the very least, I'm not going to get fired. Because this big brand consultancy, I've got the safety of that brand, and they're telling me they did it with this other big brand. So, I can't be criticized too much for following this approach.
Yeah, there's that meme that says nobody ever got fired for hiring McKinsey, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, it's one of the difficult, there are a couple of things that's quite difficult to consult from a complexity perspective. There are a couple of questions I really dread. One is what do you do? Because I have no idea how to succinctly articulate what I do. So where I've kind of landed at the moment is I'm a sense-making partner. But even so, who's done this before? That question, the moment you get asked that, I can tell you who else I've worked with, but they haven't really done this before.
Right.
That's the, but yeah, so there are challenges, but I think it's interesting. Early last year, we had a webinar with one of the guests was Anne Pendleton-Julian, and she articulated it in this way. She said previously, when she went into organizations with this message of complexity and that there's perpetual uncertainty, she felt a bit like Chicken Little. And now it feels like with Corona, we've all been given, like a masterclass in, unpredictability, uncertainty, complexity. And now it's as if it's become much more acceptable. People, I think, are starting to realize that they need to become more complexity fit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's just starting to happen. Yeah. And of course, those of us who are now steeped in this way of thinking, what we hope doesn't happen is a bunch of people come out with their 5-step plan for managing in complexity, right?
It's already happening, Richard, unfortunately. I won't name names, but it's the usual suspect. It's funny. So a couple of years ago, so you never really used to read about complexity in mainstream, like business publications like Harvard Business Review, for example. And then a few years ago, it started coming in. But what I found so amusing is it's usually combined with a verb that's something along the lines of taming complexity or simplifying. It's like almost we can help you get rid of it. And I see, so what consultancies tend to do is they take their
or indeed managing complexity, the phrase I just used, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you can manage it if you manage differently. I think that's one of the things, that I find useful about Cynefin. Dave Snowden, and now I'm kind of going on a rabbit trail, but he talks about the original meaning of the word manage. And how it used to be much more linked to, I think it's the Spanish or the Italian, I can't remember, meaning of riding a horse in dressage, not managing a household. I think that was the French influence. And I think if you think about that, you're not really managing that horse. It's like a co-evolution, you're trusting each other. It's a relationship. And so I think it's Donella Meadows that says you can dance with the system. So I think that you can definitely manage in complexity, but I don't think that you can tame it. I definitely don't think that you can simplify it necessarily, but that's what gets sold.
Right, but it's so interesting the metaphors you're linking together there, because you've gone from that route of manage to dance to co-evolution, right? And a lot of people will take that, who are in a different paradigm, and I really think this is a paradigm shift, will take that starting point, manage, and then talk about systems and KPIs and best practices and process, right? So it's not so much in the language, is it? It's the metaphors we start to apply around a particular term.
Yeah, I think it's the meanings. I've been on a bit of a crusade lately around the words responsible and accountable. Right. Because I think many of, but they're just examples. It's like manage has come to mean a certain thing. The moment you say the word, people have multiple meanings. You may not mean those meanings, but they just, it immediately comes to mind. And words like responsibility and accountability, when they get used in a corporate context, most often they are linked to things like who can be blamed, who's culpable. There's like they also tend to keep our silos intact, these responsibility things. And so I've been toying with the idea, what if we turn responsibility into responsibility? It's not a new idea, but because, what I find fascinating, I do some work, for example, with people in safety contexts.
Yeah.
And even when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and this notion of responsible leadership that has kind of started to emerge in that community, being a responsible leader when I'm in an ordered context, where everything is known, where the rules are known, where to be responsible means to follow rules, to be compliant, all of those things. Those same things could be irresponsible when the context shifts or when I find myself in complexity. So I think many of our words need reframing, or we need new words. I'm starting to wonder if trying to find new meanings for words is not almost going to take too much energy because they've just become so entrenched.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, and sometimes, I challenge Dave Snowden on what might seem to be esoteric language that he's using and he's describing. But I think there is a point here you're making that sometimes the words we've got right now just aren't fit for purpose, and we have to use these unfamiliar terms.
Yes, and I think you can take it too far. When it becomes a barrier so that when you speak, nobody understands you, I think, then you've taken it a bit too far. But I do think some new words are useful. What I find particularly useful are using analogies. One of There are a couple that I use. I know Dave Snowden, for example, introduced me to the a recipe book user versus a chef. That's a really nice analogy, but one that I find works really well, especially I thought initially only in South Africa, but it seems to span, is it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo, or it's hard to respond to a jungle if you're structured like a zoo. That kind of, it depends on the audience, but those two, it almost immediately gets the point across, how a complex system is different from a complicated system, and how if you confuse the two, then you can potentially get into trouble. So analogies, I find, work quite well.
Yes. And Liz Keogh, who's been on this show, and you may, is actually another author in this book where I came across your writing, does wonderful work with metaphors. I think she talks about complicated as being kind of greasy. I don't remember exactly the language that she used, but like a machine, like greasy and clunky, and then complex. I don't know, but she has this sort of organic metaphor, right? It's sort of squidgy and and I love that idea of like moving into sort of more poetic, sometimes more poetic language as a way to give people a sense of the ideas.
Yeah, there are a couple of poets. One of my favorites, I don't know if you've ever come across his work, David White, with a Y. He's an Irish poet. He actually works he does leadership work in corporates, but his poetry just really captures that spirit of complexity for me, so well. I was saying to you earlier, a friend of I'm doing some work now with a friend of mine, creating it's almost like capacity building modules for some of our clients, combining complexity and mindfulness. And some of the things that we're building there, it's things like curiosity and play and imagination. And, we find ourselves going to things like poetry quite often, because I think there's something in the arts, people in the arts, just some of them at least, have a very intuitive understanding of complexity.
Right. So tell me more about that, because one of the things that, I know in my interactions with Dave has been, there seems to be a bias against thinking too much about the individual, right? Because this Cynefin and a lot of the sort of complexity thinking comes from this idea of thinking about the system, right? The whole. And what we're looking to do as interveners in that system or consult, whatever we want to call ourselves, we're looking for patterns across the system, and we're asking ourselves the questions: what intervention could we make that might shift a pattern here? How could we change a boundary here or change a constraint in the system to cause some impact? And if we want to work at scale, right, that's the idea. If we want to have a big impact, then we've got to think in terms of the collective, really, the system, and not waste too much time on worrying about the individual. And yet here you are talking about taking complexity and applying it to mindfulness, which I'm assuming is working on the individual and their mindfulness. Am I right?
Yeah, this is a running disagreement between me and Dave. Although I think, probably there are more places where we agree than disagree. But I think for me, it's an and, Richard. And what I have seen too much of in the past is an over-focus on the individual. So it's when we want to create systems change, we tend to make it, all around, we need to train our people in the new culture, or, we need to train them to be agile, or whatever the case might be. And my analogy for that is, you send people off and you teach them in a training course jungle skills, and then you bring them back and you put them straight back in the zoo, and you expect them to be able to practice. It's like, why would you do that? But where I think I disagree slightly from Dave is I don't think that you can ever remove the individual completely from the equation, and you need to work on the structure and the system, and especially on the constraints. It's one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of at the moment in South African corporates, but I'm sure it's not only here. There's this really weird interplay and tension between the constraints that people are currently experiencing. So on the one hand, they are experiencing these rigid constraints, like lockdowns imposed by governments, can't go to the office, sitting, behind, you're constrained to being, behind a screen. And on the other hand, they are experiencing a complete dissolution of boundaries. So all of the rituals, the little things that helped us transition from one identity into another, those are just gone. And many of the corporates I work with, it's as if, there's no understanding that we need to adjust our performance expectation. We need to really consider, what's happening. We're starting to see very high levels of burnout because, leaders are saying, but our people need to self-manage. And it's no, you need to create environments where they are permissioned in a way to self-managed, where you help them put boundaries in place. Because if people are telling stories, some of our SenseMaker studies, we get stories there of people, senior people, feeling guilty for not working on a Friday night. If that is the kind of environment that you're creating and that your processes and your policies, if that is the environment, then, it's an indictment on the system. And also, I think changing how things connect, and this is very much where Dave is working, and I enjoy working there as well. But then if you don't enable individuals, with the skills that they need to function in complexity, and this is where I think some of the mindfulness, I found it really useful. Because when you're dealing with something that's extremely messy, and you're starting to get that sense of being overwhelmed, and you feel the pressure coming, just being able to take a step back, breathe. Ron Heifetz talks about getting onto the dance floor.
Yeah.
Being able to see the patterns in your context, but also, the patterns, that's showing up for you somatically. I think those are things that can really help individuals. And then I guess the other thing that I'm seeing is for many organizations, there's a realization that they need to change their structures and their systems. But then, the reality is many organizations, they sit, for example, with narcissistic leaders right at the top who just block everything. So then for me, it's about the individual, the collective, and then the broader social context. And I don't think that you can ever really bring change if you don't focus on all three.
Yeah. That totally aligns with where it's like it's complexity all the way down, right? And all the way up. because what's a human being if not a complex system, right? We're a complex organism. And the way I see it in terms of sort of my own growth and development has been the more of the self-development work that I do, the more of the, I do yoga and meditate, sometimes meditation, a lot of trauma release work, is I become less attached to certainty, right? And I think it's my ego that wants to attach to certainty. It's my ego that wants to tame complexity, to use your phrase from earlier. So I think the more that I can do work on myself, and as you said, sort of become my own witness, right? Breathe, find ease in my body, I can be with that uncertainty. And that, so it's like I can't divorce the two. I can't divorce a sort of a deepening intellectual understanding of complexity and ability to practice with those principles with my own self-development and self-work.
I'm fully with you, Richard. And I think I also suffer from maybe an overblown curiosity, so I'm interested in so many things, and I tend to see connections between so many different things. But some of my, I'm extremely interested, and I've been interested in this for quite a while. For example, in systems psychodynamics and group relations work, and part of that came from, I firmly believe I can't give to my clients what I don't have. So if I can't be comfortable with extreme uncertainty and ambiguity and being in an emergent context, I can't take my clients into that space, if workshops or whatever I'm doing. And so I've one of the ways that I like to disrupt myself is to go to, for example, Tavistock working conferences. And it is some of the most confronting experiences, especially from the perspective of a white South African. And being confronted with these multiplicity of perspectives and the emotions and the pain and the projections and the trauma, and to learn how to sit in it, to know that I can't necessarily solve it. The best I can do is to be there and in some way contain my own responses and maybe contain some of what's in the system. And some of the lenses that I've learned in those spaces have been the most useful for me when I consult in organizations. I don't necessarily bring it in as is, but it informs how I see the complexity and how I see people's response to the complexity, and to have empathy with some of these people who, they're people high up in organizations, their decisions impact. So, the stakes are really high. And so I can understand their anxiety a little bit better, so I don't think that you can ever remove the individual human. But if you only focus there, then, you're also not going to make much of an impact. You need to also look at the system and the very practical things to be able to make a change. You have to open the zoo gates.
Yeah. You have to open the zoo gates, and that is a wonderful metaphor because and maybe coming full circle, that is perhaps one of the most important things you can do, because once you've done that, people as individuals might will find a way to realign, to balance, to grow. Once they're given the conditions, and maybe you have to worry less about the coaching and the training and all the rest of it. So maybe it is the most important, but as we're saying, it's not only that.
Mm. And, if you understand, the animal kingdom, you can't just open the gates and chase them out. They'll all die, so you have to prepare them in some way with new skills. And another group of people I really enjoy hanging out with are, it's like a new generation of sports coaches. They talk about a constraints-led approach to coaching, where they're shifting from skills development, where you kind of do the, you teach children, for example, how to dribble a ball, and it's about repetition until you can perfectly dribble that ball, to creating contexts by manipulating constraints, where, for example, the constraints open up the opportunity, the affordance, what they call it, the affordance for action, where a gap opens up and it affords the action of dribbling the ball through the gap to score. And so they learn how to be adaptive players. They learn how to play or they learn how to see these affordances. And I think there's a really interesting way of bringing some of that thinking into the corporate world. So not rote skills training, but how do we create learning ecologies, really? Where shifts in the system creates new affordances, and we teach people how to see and act on those. So that's another something that I'm pondering at the moment.
Yes, I love that. It reminds me of something I saw within the Canevin community forum about a complicated play park and a complex one. All right, so a complicated slide might have a ladder up to the top of the slide and then a slide down, and it's it's very clear you're going to end up with a best practice for climbing that ladder and getting down the slide. Versus the more modern one, which is it might just be a mound, right? And there's an affordance there. There's an affordance for you as a child to climb that mound to get to the top of the slide, but you choose how you climb up, right? And the route, and and so I think that's right. I think it's permeating all kinds of fields in interesting ways. And I agree. And for my own work in terms of training and coaching, that's what I'm moving much more to that. Not even thinking about the term training. It's like, I'm not going to train you to do anything. I'm just going to give you certain opportunities that will present themselves as chances to develop certain skills. Mm. And you may surprise me, right? You may use a skill I hadn't even considered to get to a particular outcome.
Yeah, and I think that is what gives some people who like control and a bit of an allergic reaction, because they, you don't know what people will do when you give them freedom. And it's Yeah, Alicia Guerrero, she's also, she does a lot of, I don't know if you've come across her work, philosopher, does a lot of writing on constraints. She actually was quite a strong influence on Dave Snowden's thinking. But at a complexity conference, this was just before Corona, this was towards the end of 2019, she said something that just really struck me. You know, she said, if we collectively as a human species cannot become more comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, then that's going to be problematic, because it means anyone who promises certainty will always have a following. You know, and if you think about who the people are that's promising certainty, you know, they're not the kind of leaders that we necessarily want in the world.
Right. But what's interesting is virtually all leaders in all realms kind of have to provide that, right? You know, virtually all, right? There are some that manage not to, but it's so pervasive, isn't it? In our sort of in our societal paradigm, if you like, in terms of who we look to be our leaders.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite quotes, and now I must just try and remember who said it. It'll come to me, but it's one of the people from Santa Fe Institute, if I'm not mistaken. I'll come to it. He said, "We have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants."
Ah, lovely. Yeah.
And you know, that is, I think that is what's pervasive, and it's really nice to have a certainty merchant providing certainty for you. You can be dependent, you know. I mean, it's somebody tells me what to do, and you know, I'm immediately in that dependent state where, you know, I know who to blame. So I think it's one of the other things that's kind of been co-developed, this need for certainty. And I think you can give people a certain amount of certainty, but you know, I think any leader that promises complete certainty at the moment is, you know, he's setting himself up for failure. There's just no way that you can, not in the disruptive world that we live in. So, but I think that, you know, that is the projection onto leaders. You need to have answers. You need to know. You know, that is how many of them got to where they are today, is by being the people who had the answers and who knew. So now to be in this world where they can't know and they have to say, I don't know, it's very anxiety provoking.
Yeah. And there's some good science, I believe, in terms of people who tend to get promoted in organizations. There's a very strong relationship between overconfidence and getting to the top of organizations. And I think that the line is, you know, literally the bullshitters get to the top, right? Those who, you know, are prepared to just come out with anything on the you know, in the moment and sound certain, you know, statistically speaking, are more likely to get promoted.
And I get that. You know, also if you think about what you like in a leader, you know, it's and I think it's these. I think we've really bought into these discourses, these narratives around what a good leader is. You know, they're visionary, and they can make us feel safe, and they're inspiring, and they know where they're going. And you know, it's honestly, Richard, I don't want to be a leader in today's world. I think the pressure. If I imagine myself like being the president of a country or being just the CEO of a large organization in today's context, there's not enough money in the world.
Right.
There's no way that you can live up to people's expectations, you know. And I think this is, you know, another aspect of what we spoke about earlier, this idea of the individual versus the collective. You know, I think that I'm very interested in these new emergent ideas about what leadership looks like in complexity. Because I think we've seen multiple things now with Corona. We've seen the impact that one leader can make. And, you know, so we've got, you know, the example, for example, of the New Zealand Prime Minister. If you compare them to others, you know, like what's happening in Brazil or in India or even in the US before we had Mike Pence, you know, the impact of an individual leader has become very obvious. But then at the same time, we've also become very aware of the impact of the collective and the system, and how many of the problems we've got are systemic. So again, it's that and.
Yeah, no, it's that and so tell me a little bit in more detail, the project you've got to tie this with mindfulness, because obviously mindfulness has become such a broad term. There's another word, right, that gets used in multiple ways. What's your direction with it?
So essentially, what we're doing, and it's still developing, so we, but my friend Casper and I, we've been wanting to work together for a while. And what we're seeing is that very often people they've got a conceptual understanding of complexity. They understand that what they're dealing with is complex. But then when it comes to actually, acting in different ways or not falling back into old ways of managing, there's a bit of a barrier there. And what we've realized is very often there's a somatic response to, being in this messiness that is complexity, because we've been taught, throughout, our school careers, you need to have the answers. We don't really value questions. We value answers. So when you're in that space where you don't have one, or when, one of the things that, you would know with Cynefin, we say that in complexity, you need to experiment, you need to run safe to fail probes. For many people, almost the somatic response to knowing that failure is kind of just inherently part of, or making mistakes, maybe learning, is an inherent part of being in complexity. There's a almost an immediate anxiety response for many people, and then they react. And so one of the key things that we're focusing on is how can we give people the skills to be able to take a step back, to notice what is happening both externally and internally, and to respond, not react. And also, it's interesting because I know mindfulness have got many different, meanings to different people, but that's almost the key aspect of this, is to be able to become aware of your own responses, to be able to manage them, and to then become, switch off that knee-jerk reaction kind of. And then, as I said, some of the other things that we're, in complexity, you need to be, open to new perspectives. You need to be able to engage with curiosity, not with judgment. You need to be open to learning. And so, ironically, many of the things that we're developing are almost getting people back in touch with some of the skills that came naturally to them before they went to school. So that's part of what we're, as I said, it's still emerging, but it is really interesting because the way that Casper has been using Cynefin, for example, for a long time, is it's almost as a way to calm the nervous system. Because he said, if you can just get people to take a step back and give them a framework through which they can notice and make sense, and they have language to describe what they're dealing with, it almost calms down the nervous system. So that was a brand new application of Cynefin I haven't really thought about. So it's been really interesting to collaborate with him.
Wow, yeah. And what have you found then in terms of your own growth with this? Have you noticed changes in how you respond to situations? What's come out of this for you personally?
I'm one of those people that kind of really struggle to become quiet. I've really struggled with meditation, for example, but I found just connecting to the breath and knowing that I need to be more aware of my body. I tend to be in my head. I tend to ignore what's going on, and just to be aware of what's happening, and knowing that, I need to not only focus on what's happening conceptually or what's happening cognitively, but I also need to tap into what's happening, in my gut. How am I feeling? That has been quite transformative. I can't say that I've, gotten there completely, but I think it's I think my own journey reflects a lot of what some of my clients are going through. It's shifting from almost ignoring everything below the neck, and understanding that, I've always said complexity isn't new to humans. We've always been in complexity. All of our social contexts, when you navigate, when you're in traffic, when you're driving on the road, when you're using public transport, when you're with your extended family, all of those contexts are complex contexts. But then when we get into the work context, it's almost as if we now believe everything around us is ordered and structured. And so just reminding yourself and reminding myself that I already know how to deal with this. I just need to kind of tap into that different intelligence has been very, very transformative, especially combined with some of the experiences that I've had with the psychodynamic community, because there you get confronted with things where you want to immediately react.
Right.
And that is if I'm reacting to a projection onto me that I'm in that moment feel is extremely unfair and I'm extremely offended, then the dynamic you create, it can be extremely destructive. So that has been really useful for me. I feel like I'm rambling now. You must stop me.
No, I love that. And that resonates for me, like it deliberately exposing ourselves to sort of triggering, right? To use it. Situations that can be enormous, can provide for a lot of growth. And I found it in my own self-work with my family, right? There's a kind of one school of thought that says, if you come from a kind of a traumatic background, then it's better to, what's it called? When you, family of origin, so you defoo, right? You decouple from your family of origin, right? You're defooing, right? And the other school of thought is, no, you want to kind of continue the exposure, right? To stir the pot, as a friend of mine says, right? Because actually that's where a lot of the growth has been. And that's what, that's the route I've taken. And whether it be your family who you find triggering, or whether it be, people you might meet in psychodynamic groups or whatever, I do think there's a lot to be said for that. And even with this podcast, sometimes I'll read a book and I'll literally hate the book. And I'll be screaming at the author. And I'm thinking, and then there's a little voice in me is like, no, get that person on. Because, there's going to be growth, in the guests that sort of wind you up as much as the ones, that you feel deep resonance with.
Yeah, I think it's a skill that we've almost unlearned, is to be with people that we disagree with. And not reject them, but just, I don't have to agree with you to be in the same space as you, and to be respectful, and to also be curious about what it is that you believe, what your perspective is. I think we've just lost that. It's almost like we can't bear to be in places with people who don't think like us.
Yeah, and I think and obviously that's playing out in social media, right? We're getting narrower and narrower in terms of who we allowed in the garden, and with the cancel culture. It was interesting to me that we had Tony Blair, who's been a sort of, to some extent, a hero for many who sort of have more progressive politics, and he's now saying, he's concerned about what he can talk about, right? So it's almost like there's this cleavage, right? There's society seems to be going in one direction, which wants everything to be sort of ordered and manicured and managed. And then there's a sort of another emerging, it seems to me, sort of strain in society is, no, come on, let's open up to our humanity. Let's get in touch with our feelings. Let's engage in growth and experimentation and bring on the uncertainty, right? It's one of, this is something, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that sits in that psychodynamic community, but I think there aren't many spaces where I think environments can be created that can contain all of this. Because we're so, I think we've fallen into this thing of we need to be politically correct and we need to use just the right language. And everybody's almost become too scared to ask a question or say something wrong. And then they either become super, politically correct, or they just stay quiet. And I think that creates toxic environments where we can just never be honest with each other. And what I find in those communities and in those sessions is that there you can say anything. And, you can
it can be worked with. There's one of the principles there is if I can make something speakable, it becomes workable. And I think now what's happened is we've just made a whole bunch of things unspeakable.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's healthy at all.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because it's almost like we're shutting ourselves off to nature somehow, because of course human beings are all part of nature. The opinions and the beliefs that human beings have and that they express is part of nature, right? It's learning to be with them. Maybe we move around them. The other metaphor I like, recently was, if you walk through a forest, right? Some bushes are going to be a bit prickly. Some is going to sting you, but you don't need to develop hatred, right? For those plants in the forest. You just learn to navigate, appreciate them for the function that they play in the broader ecology, and make your choices. But we don't need to, it's like we need to be accept our place in nature, and then find ways to navigate it, right?
And I think we've forgotten how to value diversity. Here in South Africa, it's very pertinent. We've made diversity a problem to solve, and I understand why. We have a very thorny history. There are so many injustices still going on and baked into our systems, but we've essentially framed diversity as a problem to solve, and the way that we try and solve it is through quotas and all kinds of things. Whereas if you really understand complexity, and if you look at an ecosystem is fit partly because of its biodiversity. And I think the same is true of human systems. We become more resilient. We've become more fit for complexity when we have adequate diversity. And then it's beyond, just, male, female, race, etc. It's also cognitive diversity. And I just think we need to start seeing it as a strategic asset to nurture, not a problem to solve. But, that also seems to be a discourse that's become really settled.
Yeah, and often the approach is to, a top-down, bureaucratic, in the same way of thinking. And I think, the diversity that we all need to start to embrace is diversity in our own bodies, right? The diversity of feelings that we have, right? The diversity of our reactions to different stimuli. Like there's so much diversity ready that so many of us are failing to accept in our own beings, let alone out there. So again, I suppose it's just another example of you got to work at all levels.
My friend Casper, he says you've got the perfect gym for dealing with complexity just in your own mind. When you get quiet and all of the thoughts come, and it's like perfect gym for you to experience and practice dealing with complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the chapter in the book that you wrote, you talked about these organizing principles around complexity. I guess we've talked a lot about embracing messiness or messy coherence. Is there anything else you'd like to say about those principles that we've not touched on?
I think just for me, so they're in the book as Cynefin organizing principles, but I think they can just as well be, dealing with complexity organizing principles, and some of it relates back to your initial question about what I didn't enjoy about being a consultant, and one of those principles is, you need to allow a system to develop descriptive self-awareness. Don't bring the answers. Don't bring your perspective as a consultant. It's help the system see itself. That's one. And then I guess almost my favorite one, well, I really love messy coherence, but the third one on rhythm and timing, I think is also so important, and especially in today's world with agile and all of these things coming into organizations. It seems like we keep trying to speed everything up, and understanding that sometimes you need to slow down. The best thing to do is to sit and do nothing. I think many companies, what I see is for example, they do a restructure, and then almost immediately, like 2 months afterwards, they do another one. They don't give the intervention they've already done the chance to settle and actually have an impact. And so this idea of knowing when to slow down, knowing when to speed up, Alicia Juarero again, she used this wonderful idea of contrasting Chronos and Kairos time. And Kairos is when timing and context meet almost. Yes, and I think, we just, with all of our speeding up, we miss these Kairos moments, where there's an opportunity, for example, to bring it when the disposition of a system is just right for big change, but we miss it because we're just busy speeding up. And so, yeah, I think I feel passionate about all of those principles, but, I think, just remembering, it's been a while since I wrote that. So remembering what's in there, those are what comes to mind now.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you picked up on that Kairos versus Chronos, because, it's right now, obviously both of us work in sort of management fields, so that's what's pertinent to us. But, so much of it's done on Chronos time, right? It's the plan. It's the 3-year plan. We're going to do this by this quarter and this by the, and that idea is such an anathema, right? To the sort of management class, if you like, right now, to say, well, we know this is where we want to get to. Let's just wait. Let's be patient and let's wait for the right moment. Right? That you just couldn't walk into a boardroom in the land and say that, right?
Yeah, and they suffer for not doing that. And I think, coming back to the whole mindfulness conversation, I think even just cultivating that ability to sit in messiness, to not jump to an answer, to be able to wait, to not, again, that reaction that we tend to have. But I think knowing when to act and when not to act is one of the key kind of things that a decision maker needs to know or needs to learn. That discernment almost.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's come up in my own life recently. So I'm in my mid-40s now, and I had my testosterone tested, and it's a little low, right? And that can have effects on, well, there's the obvious wig effects, but there's also the, decisiveness. You can have foggy brain, low energy, right? There's a whole bunch of things that come along, which I've been experiencing. And I've been going to the gym a bit more because I know that can help. But then one guy I spoke to, he said, that's the worst thing you can do, right? Ditch the personal trainer, ditch the gym. You're overstressed. What you actually need to do is to slow down and stop and allow your hormonal system to kind of get back into balance, because a lot of what you're using to generate cortisol as a stress response is being taken away from your ability to, balance the rest of your hormones. And it sort of hit me like in the chest, that just stop, slow down, breathe, right?
One of the most interesting things that I encountered 2 years ago is a friend of mine who's in the performing arts, who spoke about the importance of boredom and how we never allow ourselves to be bored anymore, and how creativity very often flows from boredom. And it's this, we want to be stimulated all the time. We want to be busy all the time. We want to go fast. It's like, I can't even wait for 5 minutes for my food to arrive. And so it is very countercultural, this thing of just slow down, sit and do nothing, be bored. It's not a very popular message.
No, but so important. Yeah. How are we doing on time? So we come up on the hour here. Are you?
I'm okay to go on. I heard the doorbell, so if I can quickly go and get my delivery,
sure.
And you can.
I'll press pause. Okay, you're back from collecting your shopping. So yeah, it's funny. I was just reflecting on how we'd been talking about the importance of stopping and allowing yourself to be bored. And immediately you went off to grab your shopping. I'm like reaching for my phone, want to go check the news site and my emails. And I was like, Richard, stop. Put the phone on airplane. And I literally just allow myself to stand here and be bored for a few minutes. It's good.
It is an addiction, though. That's what it feels like. And I know that many of these, especially social media apps, are designed to be addictive. But, I have to be really intentional to not do that.
Yeah.
To just keep checking. And especially now with Corona, all of this doom scrolling, like what's happening around the world.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's, I think we underestimate, I read an article the other day where they said that we've almost unlearned, or we no longer have the ability to read long articles, to finish books, because we're so used to getting things in these little tiny tidbits. And I can see that in myself. I get very distracted quite quickly when I'm reading something long. I've got a whole stack of unfinished books.
Yeah.
So I really feel the need to, I don't know, take that step back, slow down, not get sucked into the frenzy, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Getting up above the dance floor. I almost think it's like the challenge of this phase of sort of human development, right? It's like we've been gifted all this stuff from sort of, the materiality of a modern world. And it's like the challenge no longer is to sort of get through the winter or, avoid the predators. It's a different set of challenges we're faced with now. It's actually just turning off from modernity, that this beast we created.
And it's really interesting. One of the theories that I use a lot when I'm working with teams is Antonovsky's theory of individual sense of coherence. And he talks about the three things that's needed. It's to be able to comprehend what's going on, to know that you can cope, and then to find meaning in it. So it's comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. And I think so many people are struggling with that meaningfulness aspect of it now. Sometimes I even find myself there. I'm still doing work I enjoy doing. I'm busy. But then when you look at everything that's happening in the world, it's almost like, what is the meaning behind this? Where do I, and I see that especially in corporate, where people are now being challenged with, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We are being confronted with our mortality, I guess. And now we're spending, how many, I don't know what the percentage is, but way too much time on Zoom calls. And our children are waiting for us, and life seems to be waiting for us. And I see many people are reevaluating what they're spending their time on. Yeah. And I think we're going to start seeing this spilling through into organizations. I think, we're going to start seeing more burnout on the one hand, but then also more people choosing to leave, choosing to exit.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens, how these patterns, we're already seeing some of the weaker signals of those patterns, some not so weak. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah. I mean, just anecdotally, the co-working space that I frequent, there's a recruitment consulting company in this space. And we had a gap between our lockdowns, right? Last year, there was in the UK, there was like a month or so where, we sort of came out and then we were, but in that period, the boss of this firm had said to his staff, right, I want you all back in the office. And it was mutiny, right? The entire staff, they all collectively said, no, we're not coming back in. Our numbers for the last, during the lockdown have been better than they were before. So you've got no rationale to have us back in. We're not coming back in. So you kind of had to admit defeat, and they didn't come. So yeah, I think I can see that there will be, there will be that complete shift.
Really, yeah. It's interesting. It's almost 50-50 in some of the, like research we're doing, for example, using SenseMaker. There's lots of people saying there's no way I'm coming back. We even had stories where people say, if you force me to sit in traffic for an hour every day again, I'm leaving. And then there are others who are saying, I just cannot wait to get back to the office. Can we just, so there seems to be these two perspectives. And it's going to be, I think the key question that organizations are going to have to answer is, how do they build environments where people feel that they can bring more of themselves to work, where they can find meaning, and do work that they enjoy and make a living. And I know that for some roles it's not necessarily possible, but I think organizations. I saw I think it was a Medium article the other day where the person was writing from the perspective of an employee and basically saying, we don't give an F about your culture. And many of the companies, the leaders, the way that they are presenting why people need to come back is because they're saying it's bad for our culture. We don't know how to create a coherent and a, culture of belonging when people are spread everywhere, and they're just saying, we don't care. So you need a better argument than that, I think. That's going to be part of the challenge, I think.
Yeah. 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 That's fascinating, because people are starting to ask, well, what who's this culture serving? This culture you want to create, who's benefiting from it? Because when I'm not seeing my kids and I'm stuck in traffic 2 hours a day, I'm not sure it's me, right? So yeah, it's interesting.
And many companies, I think, now have also shown their true colors. Some really did well. They showed their humanity to some extent in this. And others kind of showed that when you say you care about your people, it really is just lip service. It's some of the companies that I've seen, it's almost like there's no recognition that we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And the social and the economic impacts. They just expected people to work all. One of my clients here, we ran a sense maker study, and we got stories there saying it's 3:00 in the morning that I'm completing this, and it's because it's the only time I have. If you create contexts like that, then I feel that you almost deserve that your people leave.
Yeah. And we should explain for people who are not familiar with the sense maker tool. It's a way of capturing mini stories about people's experiences in the workplace. But what's so powerful of it is you get these verbatim quotes, which really illustrate what's happening in a culture, right?
Yeah, and it's some of those stories are really inspiring. People can be so creative with some of the things that they come up with. Like how they imagine the office of the future. And then others are, you read them and it's like, you can't believe that, people create work environments like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that people, well, this is the other thing, is why we come back to mindfulness and so on, I think a lot of the reason these cultures persist is that people aren't, as you say, they're cut off from the neck downwards. So their head is telling them, well, the salary's good, allows me to pay my mortgage. The head is telling them I've got, high status, I've got this title and I can drive this car. So the head sort of, it all makes sense. But below the neck, it might be screaming, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm snapping at with my kids. There could be a whole bunch of stuff that's happening. I'm feeling sluggish. I feel all of these things might be going on below the neck. But if you're not in touch with them, you can work 20, 30, an entire career in quote toxic environment and never leave, because you're not tapped into the data that's telling you maybe you should leave.
And I think that same thing also creates a severe lack of empathy, because I think the other reality is there are many people who can't leave. Coming back to our diversity conversation, there are many people that they don't have the luxury to leave and find a job that's more meaningful, or they are fully dependent on that job. And I think we that same thing of only being in your head, I think it also cuts you off from really putting yourself in the shoes of some of those people who don't have the like here in South Africa, it's really stark. So people who work in the same company, sometimes even more or less on a similar level, one person would be living in a middle class, 3-bedroomed house. You're able to, create an office for yourself. You've got access to internet, and somebody else would be living in a shack and trying to deal with all of these things. So one of the things that I believe is, I think COVID and this whole pandemic has given us a huge opportunity to really rethink the nature of work, how we structure ourselves, what leadership and management means, all of these things. But what I'm seeing is that many companies feel that the change has already happened. When they manage to shift from having all of their people office bound to, they're very proud of it. And I mean, it is a big achievement. We moved 30,000 people to be able to work, remotely within 2 weeks. But it doesn't end there. Because now we've got an old model of working forced into a new mechanism almost, but we haven't really gone back to the drawing board and thought about what else needs to change. And I think that's the challenge. And I think some of the, maybe not the answers, but some of the questions I think lie in the space of complexity. new ways of thinking about structuring and seeing organizations as flow systems, thinking about what needs to flow, all of those things I think we need to get our heads around.
Yes, that's right. And this is why I get it is the individual, because you just told that story about the guy, 3:00 in the morning is the only time I can write this, right? If we present that to one leader who, is in a certain frame, they may not respond with empathy. They may not be open to the experiments that you might conduct to shift the culture such that it doesn't happen. But somebody who sort of has done the work and can allow themselves to tune into it, can allow themselves to empathize, that can then be a spur for action. So I agree with you. Complexity can create the kind of the space and the tools to explore, but unless individual leaders have done the work to sort of use that data in a way that's sort of meaningful and productive, it's for now, right?
It's why, to me, there's no other way than to deal with the system and the individual, or the collective and the individual, because most of the really well-intentioned change efforts that I've seen, happen in organizations, many of them, they rise and fall on being able to get a particular leader to approve what people want to do. And if that person, as you say, is somebody who hasn't done the work, who still wants to control everything, who's all about the profits, and short-term thinking, linear thinking, all of those things, then unfortunately it just dies a slow death. And you can, I do believe that you can stimulate change bottom up, but I don't know if we've got the time for that.
Well, you can stimulate it, but can you sustain it? I mean, that's been my professional experience. You can stimulate a lot bottom up. You can get a lot of things going. Put energy into teams, and you can do sometimes quite remarkable things at a kind of team level or a department level. But for it to sustain, right, and for once that sort of the energy of that coach or that intervention has dissipated, for it to sustain, you've got to go all the way through the organization. Has been my experience.
And I find it so ironic. One of the things people don't always realize about Cynefin is that it's a dynamic framework. So things don't necessarily sit in a particular domain and stay there. There are dynamics between these domains. And one of the dynamics, I think it's been reframed a little bit now that Dave has changed the framework a bit, but we used to call it a shallow dive into chaos. And the idea was that, when you are in a chaotic environment where all of a sudden, you can't perceive any constraints, you can't see patterns, it's just everything seems to be random. Typically, this is a domain of crisis. Yeah. And I think with COVID, we I think almost the entire world has been through a shallow dive into chaos, and now we're kind of vacillating between confusion and complexity. But it feels, because that shallow dive into chaos, it's typically when change is really possible. It's when innovation happens, when things that used to work no longer work, and you can question those, what I'd like to call holy cow rules and policies and things. And it feels to me like we have wasted that opportunity in many companies. It's like people are they just so want to go back to normal, whether it's the old normal or the new normal. I think normal is a code word for, I just want things to be stable and predictable again. I just want to have some certainty. And I think we are going to miss the opportunity to really make use of this disruption to bring fundamental change if we just want to force things back to some kind of normality again. That I think is my biggest fear of what's going to happen now post-pandemic.
That's fascinating. And I see that in myself, right? I see myself asking myself that question, what is the new normal? But that's the sort of the certainty merchant in me wanting an answer. Like, what can I tell our clients is going to be the new normal? Like, yeah, absolutely. It's
And I've remembered now, the certainty merchant quote is Diego Espinosa. I told you it'll come to me. So that's
I love, certainty merchant. And what was the quote again? The full quote?
We have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, there's entire industries built around being certainty merchants. Just think life insurance, or, it's like the whole retirement industry. It's fascinating just how pervasive that has become.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like, it's almost like we outsource at some level, like our soul, like we outsource like our humanity, right? It's, our brilliance, right? Our ability, this unique, ability we all have to navigate complexity and, be resourceful in the face of ambiguity and complexity. Like it's in all of us.
And I created a framework that I called the Ways Finder. And as I was, going through that process, I really became fascinated with, the idea of wayfinding and how, cultures like the ancient Polynesians and, even the Vikings and all of these, like early, navigating communities or cultures, how they would just almost fearlessly just head into the unknown with that spirit of adventure. And, there's so many things that you can't just take those practices and put them down in the modern world. They're very interlinked with spiritual ideas and things. But I think we really need to reconnect with some of that, with seeing almost uncharted territory and the unknown as, exciting sometimes. It provokes anxiety, but if you think about it, you can't have an adventure if there's not some kind of unknown aspect to it. If there's not some uncertainty, then it's not really an adventure. Then already know everything. It's might be an interesting experience, but it can't be an adventure if there's nothing uncertain or ambiguous or unexpected about it. So I do think we need to reconnect with that. We need to rebuild that relationship that we used to have and that we still have. I mean, if we're all honest, we know that our lives are not certain. We like to pretend that they are, but they're not. So it's just accepting reality, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, and practicing it. Like a guy I follow online talks about he stopped using Google Maps, for certain appointments. He's just like, okay. And this is in Australia. And he's got to drive like halfway across, a significant distance. And he's just like, okay, I'm just going to follow my nose, right? I'm just going to force himself to sort of tap into his intuition to find this place.
And again, it's when people ask me, what is the right thing to do? I almost say, the only really, the only answer that's always right in complexity is it depends. And so if I have like half an hour to get to the other side of the city to make it to a meeting, then I want to use Google Maps because, I need. But if that becomes the default, I'm never going to, just encounter something new or discover, if I just keep using Google Maps. So I think it is this importance of context again. Right where we started with what I really loved about complexity, it kind of comes back to that again, context.
Yeah, context, and then consciously putting us. But it's like, but I think what's also emerging for me here is like we've talked about principles, and obviously what Keogh provides is this wonderful sort of intellectual, conceptual framework for thinking about complexity, and you've talked about principles. But there is then the practice, right? These practices that we're starting to talk about, whether it be mindfulness and sensing into our bodies, whether it be about, trying to get there without a map that, allows us to confront ambiguity or confusion even, allowing ourselves to be bored, allowing ourselves, as you talk about your psychodynamic, context to face opinions or beliefs that we find objectionable, right? All of these you could almost consider like practices, right?
Yeah, Edgar Morin, he said, we need to get away from a conceptual or we need to go beyond a conceptual understanding of complexity to an embodied, complexity. And I think that's what I think you're referring to. And that I agree with you. I think that probably is the shift that we need to make, because I don't know that there are many leaders out there who would deny that we live in a complex world, if you ask them. I think that penny has dropped. The problem is that they are not living into that yet. They're still falling back to the old complicated habits, things that they are comfortable with, things that, bring certainty, that allow them to control things. So I think it is this almost embodied, and that does lie in things like practices, new tools. I just understanding conceptually that's where we are. I don't think that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as I look at my own life, it's like I'm totally sold on the intellectual. I get the principles. I can talk about the principles. But even now, what's emerging for in this conversation right now is there's probably a whole lot more that I can do around like consciously thinking about the practices that I'm engaging in, and perhaps how I could do more of them. To build, if you like, that sort of set of muscles and that new way of orienting to the world. And then, as you say, that it still gives you the choice, right? You could still move into the patterns of thinking and the tools that make sense for a more ordered context. But you don't leave that behind. But you just then develop that capability to be in complexity.
I think one of the most damaging things that happened, a couple of probably, I don't know how many years ago, I can't remember, but when complexity first started emerging as language in the business world, it almost entered the space as if, everything is complex. You can't manage complexity, and I think that just scared everybody off. And I think many people, they think about complexity as a space that's unbounded or where there's no structure. And one of the things that I don't agree with is this whole movement around, almost demonizing hierarchies. It's right. Almost like and I think the key thing is to understand that it's not complexity they are structures. They just look different. There's these enabling constraints. Even, one of my favorite writers in the complexity domain is Professor Paul Sillier. He was based here in Stellenbosch in South Africa, but he passed away a few years ago. And he says part of the vitality of a complex system lies in its ability to maintain adaptive hierarchies.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's not about just, letting everything go and we flatten everything and now we're in this boundaryless world. But boundaries will always, you'll get some psychological boundaries emerging if you do that. But it's understanding that, there is structure and you can manage, but you need that they look different and you need to manage differently. And so, I think it's about just learning how to stand with one foot in each of these systems, because we do still have ordered systems, but we've focused there for so long. We need to understand that most of these ordered systems are surrounded. It's like a zoo, but it's surrounded by a complex system.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And that system will intrude.
Right. As it's just done, right, over the last couple of years. And that's right. It's like we've got this great gift as human beings to create these ordered systems, to create productive predictability, but it's almost like it could become, a fascination, an addiction, and it's we've got to be able to sit in both. Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. Good. Well, is there anything else we've not talked about? I really enjoyed this.
Well, it seems like we've kind of touched on many, many things. There are probably lots that we can explore more deeply, but nothing immediately comes to mind. I've really enjoyed this. This has been fun. Yeah, no, it's been great. So for people then who've, we've mentioned this Kinevin, if people are not familiar with it, or the SenseMaker tool. So they can find out more about the SenseMaker tool at the Cognitive Edge website, right? That's the best place for people to learn more about. There's a sensemaker.cognitiveedge.com if they want to learn more about the tool. And then I blog on Medium, just under my own name, Sonja Blignaut. And I also have I have a consultancy here in South Africa, as well as a role in Cognitive Edge. So that's called morebeyond.co.za. But I think the blogs are mostly kind of repeated. So Medium might be the best place to find some of my musings. Yes. And the mindfulness, what is it going to be, an app or a platform, or like what how will that manifest? It's emerging at the moment. So right now we're building a prototype for a client, and then another one for a business school who wants to build a curriculum around complexity fitness. But we're busy setting up a website. I think it's complexityfit.co.za. But ideally, I think it'll turn into probably a self-directed learning platform. We really want to make this accessible. We feel, this is something that many, many people need to become more familiar with. So, that's And hopefully in the next month or two, it'll be ready. We're like beavering away at the moment, creating all the modules.
Wow.
So hopefully it'll be ready soon.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right. Well, we'll look forward for that coming into the world. And yeah, we'll say goodbye. And I guess you're heading into your winter now.
Yes, you can see the scarves are out, and people always laugh at me because it's about 18 or 19 degrees outside, and we are freezing. The boots and the slippers and the heaters come out, and I think you guys would see that as summer weather. So it's
exactly. Yeah,
we're heading into winter
for that right now. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So it's the diversity. It's like
yeah. Well, I hope you make it through.
I've survived almost 50 of them, so I think I'll probably make it.
Great. Well, thanks once again. This has been fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the invite.